Hi, welcome to the Motion Graphics Division of the Graphic Design Department. We typically make the following videos: press release, mobile apps, fact sheets, and news briefs. Occasionally, we also have live whole health videos. Today, we're going to go over how to use After Effects, which is like Photoshop, but with more animation effects and a timeline. Let's get started. To start off, you want to create a new composition. When you open After Effects, you can typically see it over here. But you can also go up to Composition and select New Composition, which will open up a new window. What you want to do now is name your composition. Let's name it Opening, since it's going to be the intro into the video. For VA videos, we typically have an aspect ratio of 4:5, so a width of 800 and a height of 1000 tends to work. Sometimes we also make square videos, which would be around 1080 by 1080. Now let's come down to the duration. You can change most of these in composition settings. Duration is one that you may have to go back to if you notice something needs to be longer or shorter. The one thing you want to be careful with is the dimensions, because those are harder to change later on, especially once you've added elements in. If you do change the dimensions, you may need to reposition or resize the current elements, so you're going to want to make sure you get your dimensions right, at least before you start adding elements. You can typically find your compositions in the tabs over here. You can also go to the panels on the left side and find your compositions and assets there. If you want to change anything, you can go up to Compositions and select Composition Settings. Or you can simply right-click on the composition you want to change and go to Composition Settings from there. Next, we're going to go over how you can import files. There's two main ways to import. The first is going up to Files and selecting Import. You can also go to Adobe Dynamic Link and connect with Premiere Pro if you're working with these two softwares together. The second method is simply to drag and drop. You select the files you want and drag them into the left panel. Once your assets are in the panel, you can use folders to organize your files. For example, I can create a media folder for the two files I just added. This can help you organize. For example, you have a media folder for your media files, or create folders based on assets used in each composition. Now we can get started with the fun stuff, making motion graphics. Let's try to recreate something similar to what we saw in the beginning. You want to start by going up to Layers and select New, then Solid. For now, let's stick to the VA colors. So you can click on the color block and type in the hex code for the color you want. Once you've created your solid, you can go up to the Tools panel. You'll notice there's a rectangle tool, a pen tool, a text tool, a brush tool, and so forth. The main ones you'll need to know is the text tool and shape tool. You can click on the text tool, click, and start typing. You'll notice on the right there is a characters panel, which should be fairly similar to what you'd see in Photoshop, where you can change the font size, leading, kerning, spacing between the characters. You can also make it bold, italicized, or all caps. I'm simply going to change to a smaller font and make DME larger. So once we're done messing with the font, there's also a paragraph panel where you can change whether it's left aligned, center aligned, or right aligned. So one thing that's really cool about After Effects is their Align panel, where I can make the element left aligned, center aligned, or right aligned. I can also align elements vertically. Next, let's go up to the Shape tool. Typically, the default is rectangle, but when you press Q, you can make it rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon, star, and back to rectangle. Now let's draw our line. One thing to pay attention to when using the Shape tool is making sure none of the layers are selected. Otherwise, you're going to end up drawing what's known as a mask rather than a shape. So you can see here with the layers, you can order them as much as you like. Now with everything at full opacity, the order of the layers doesn't matter quite as much outside of organization. You can also right-click a layer to rename it. For example, I'm going to rename this as line. You can also go up to the left panel and select media you would like to include in the timeline. You just need to simply drag it into the timeline. I'm going to drag this in below the text and shape layers because I want it to be part of the background. You'll notice that what makes After Effects really different from Photoshop is its timeline. It's also different from Premiere Pro and other video editing software in that it's a layer-based timeline. What I mean by that is that things always stack on top of each other, so you'll never have two assets in the same layer. Each one will be in a different layer. That's one thing to pay attention to in After Effects. Now let's get into masks. To start off, you want to select the shape tool and then select the layer you want to add a mask to. I'm going to add a mask to the DME text layer. If you come down to the lower left hand side, you'll notice next to the mask there are several different types of masks. I can say the most common ones you're going to use are none, add, and subtract. None does nothing to the layer. You're probably going to ask, so what's the purpose then? Well, it's useful when paired with effects such as stroke because it can create a path. The next one is add, which means anything inside a mask will show up. If it's outside the mask, it's going to disappear. On the flip side, there's subtract, which means anything inside a mask will not show up. It will only appear if it's on the outside. We're going to use add for now, and we're going to add a mask to motion graphics. Up to this point, we haven't created any animations. Animations is really created through keyframes, which is essential to learning After Effects. Let's start by animating the line. If we come down here to transform, you'll notice there are stopwatches next to each of these: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. One thing you'll want to pay attention to is the anchor point, because that can affect some of the other transformations. Rotation is probably the most noticeable because it rotates about the point. For example, if I shift the anchor point up here, you can clearly see how the rotation changes. One thing to keep in mind is that you'll want to have your anchor point set before adding keyframes because it can potentially mess things up if you change it midway. You can change the anchor point position by simply pressing Y and dragging it to where you want it to be. It will sometimes snap in place. Right now, I want to change the scale to have the line open up. You can click on the stopwatch to add a keyframe. You only need to do this for the first keyframe. Then you can see where you want to move in time. So this is how we want the line to end up. We're going to move backwards in time, and then we're going to change it to what we want. So if we play this through, you can see the line opening up. Once you click on the stopwatch, additional changes you make will automatically add a keyframe. So that's something you want to pay attention to. For example, if your marker is somewhere else on your timeline and you decide to change something, it's going to add a keyframe, and you may end up unintentionally creating animation or motion that you didn't need. The other thing is, if you don't click the stopwatch to add a keyframe when you wanted to create animation, for example, if you have it at one position and you shift the marker to a different place on the timeline and change the position, if you forgot to add a keyframe, nothing's going to change because there are no keyframes there. In other words, there's no animation going on. Now let's go ahead and animate the text. So let's animate the text after the line expands and have it finish around the 1 second mark. So to recreate what you saw in the beginning, you're going to want to add a keyframe for mask path and position. And we're going to do that for both Welcome to the DME and Motion Graphics. Next, we're going to go back in time to 15 frames, which is right after the line animates in. We're going to change the position. What I've been doing to change the position is using the arrow keys. You can also come up here to the selection tool and then drag the layer to change its position. Or you can simply change the numbers. You'll notice that when I move the mask, motion graphics disappears. That's because, as I mentioned before, motion graphics is no longer in the mask and we currently have it set as add. Now we're going to do the same thing for welcome to the DME. Let's see it play out. Another thing to pay attention to about keyframes is you can add a keyframe if you want it to stay still for a certain duration of time. And you can do that by clicking the diamond on the left. So if I wanted to animate in and then animate out, I'm going to have keyframes in between so that the item can stay still for a set duration. Let's say I want everything to animate out to the right. What I'm going to do is select all the layers and move it to the right, which will animate all of them. Just make sure you added a keyframe. You'll notice that I forgot to add a keyframe for the line position. So I'm simply going to work backwards and add a keyframe at the end. Move back in time and use the Align tool to center the line. This leads me to another point. So one thing to keep in mind when you use Align is that it can add a keyframe in position. Another thing I'd like to mention is that you'll notice the current animations are quite rigid. If we take a look at Graph Editor, it's currently a straight line. What we can do is select the keyframes and press F9, which will create what's known as Easy Ease keyframes. So if we come back to the Graph Editor, you'll notice the parabola shape. You can also play around with the parabola if you want the animation to be faster or slower. I'm going to add Easy Ease keyframes to the text as well. Let's take a look at what we have so far. You'll notice that it animates out, that there's a slight change in speed. It's not super noticeable since the animation only lasts 15 frames, but this is something to pay attention to if you want your animations to look more natural. You can also work with Graph Editor to edit the speed of your animations. But of course, this is something a little more advanced. We're going to move on to the second slide, which talks about video types. We're going to go over to Text Animations. If you come over to the Effects and Presets panel, you'll notice there are animation presets. If you come down to Text, you'll notice they have 3D text, Animate In, and Animate Out. You can also take a look at some of the other ones. Some offer animations in while others are more text animation effects. This is something you can play around with, and really you can find some cool things to do with text. For now, we're going to come down to video types and have it animate in. I'm going to use typewriter and drag the effect to the layer. This is what it looks like. I want this to animate in faster, and this takes us back to keyframes. We're going to come down here to Text, Animator, and then Range Selector where the keyframes appear. Here, we see the keyframes, which determines when the animation starts and ends. You can also go into Advanced and play around with the other attributes. So let's have video types animate in first, and then bring in the text with the video types listed. You'll notice in the effects panel some effects mentioned by character, by word, multi-line. So with what we have, it's useful to choose something that says each line or multi-line. I'm going to use stretch in each line. And again, come down to the text, animator, and range selector to work with the keyframes. Now let's take a look. This is a super easy way to have your text animate in without working with position or scale or any of the other categories under Transform. Next up, a thing I really like about Adobe is the interconnectedness of its different softwares. Right now, I'm going to import an Illustrator file. Here we have a composition called Character Veteran. Depending on how you set up your Illustrator file, it can bring in different layers. Because I only plan on animating 2 things, I created the file with 3 layers. I really only plan on animating the upper arm and hand. Well, these probably aren't the most accurate terms, but as long as you understand how you label things, that's good enough. To start off, I'm going to move the anchor point to the shoulder, which is where I want it to rotate. And for the hand, I'm going to move it to the elbow. I can start changing the rotation and animating it now that the anchor point is set. As you can see, the hand gets disconnected from the arm as I'm animating it. There's actually a really simple fix for this. It's called Parent and Link. In this case, I want the arm to be the parent, and I can do that by coming down here and selecting upper arm. What you'll notice is that now when I rotate the arm, the hand follows. When setting up the parent, you want to do so at a point where everything is located in the right place. Let me show you an example. If I release the current link and rotate the upper arm first, and then add the parent, you'll notice how it looks really odd now. So when you link the 2 items, it's important to pay attention to where they are at the time of linking. One thing to keep in mind is that anchor point and opacity aren't impacted by the parent link. This means that if I change the position, scale, or rotation of the parent, the link, or child will follow. However, if I change the opacity, the parent doesn't affect the child. I can animate the parent and then animate the child independently. So you can see how here both the arm and hand are rotating. Now when we come back to the video types composition, we can drag the character composition in. And I can scale it and apply different transformations to it, just like I would any other asset. You'll notice that the animation of the character continues to play out. Now, if I wanted to edit this, edit the animation, such as changing when it starts animating. For example, if I wanted to start animating at the 1 second mark, which is when the text comes in, I just need to click the composition and it takes me back to the composition where I was working with the character. Now I'm just simply going to highlight the keyframes and shift them forward. And you'll see that any changes I make in this composition will be reflected here. So you'll see how it doesn't animate until the 1 second mark. I can also add keyframes and animate the composition. I'm going to go ahead and add keyframes and have it animate in. And this is how it looks. I can also edit the composition by looking at the tabs if I haven't closed it, or to the left panel and click on the comp that I want to edit. This is how it looks overall. Another thing you can do is, if I'm working with a lot of layers, I can pre-compose. For example, if I had a lot of text layers, it can get a little burdensome to the point where I may want to group them together. You want to start by selecting the layers you want to group together. You can do this by pressing Shift and click to select multiple layers. Then you can right-click and select Pre-compose. I'm going to name this Text, and that'll bring me to a composition with all the text. So if we go back to the previous composition, you'll notice how the text layer is now a single composition. If I wanted to make any changes to the text animation, I'd have to open up the text composition. With 2 layers, there's really no need to pre-compose. This was just an example. Pre-compose is really used when you're dealing with multiple layers, and grouping things together can just make it easier. I guess you can compare it to the folders in Photoshop, where you group elements by using folders, and you can have folders within folders. Here, you group things in comps. The cool thing is that it also allows you to have 2 layers of animations if you animate the comp itself. So now let's take a look at how the timeline works. So far, we've been importing still objects. So when you place it in the timeline, its length is the same as the composition. If I import something that doesn't have a duration, like this logo, you'll notice that it's the same length as the composition. However, if I'm importing a video or audio file, anything that has a set time, you'll notice that it takes up its own duration. So if you look at this video, you'll notice how it extends past the composition length. As I'm dragging it over, you can see how it keeps going on and on. With longer files, if you're looking for a specific section, it can be challenging if your composition length is short, like we have here. Typically, it's better to mark in and out before bringing it into the comp. Now, let's make the comp duration longer. You'll notice the opposite, where the video is shorter than the comp length. However, when I change the comp duration, you'll notice how the duration of the assets that were already in the comp didn't change. If I go and drag in that same logo, you can clearly see how it takes up the comp length. So that's the main difference between graphics versus video or audio files. Another thing is the layers in the timeline. As I mentioned before, everything is in layers, which means if I want the video to play twice, I'd have to create a new layer and have them overlap, like this. One thing to be careful of is making sure you don't have gaps. As you can see, when I play back, there's a flash of black where the gap is. This isn't like Premiere Pro or video editing softwares where things snap next to each other. It's recommended that you zoom in and make sure there's no gaps. And it's like this because After Effects is more focused on motion graphics and simple animation rather than video editing. Another thing I would like to mention is the ability to manipulate the layer's duration, which is something I didn't really do in previous examples. Here, if I wanted something to come in at the 5-second mark, I can move the layer or change the duration if it's a still object to show when it enters and exits. So you can see how it enters at 5 seconds and leaves at 20 seconds. This was a quick intro to how the After Effects timeline works. Now that you understand the basics of After Effects, let's take a look at some common mistakes. For starters, scaling is something a lot of people mess up on. A lot of people are used to scaling by dragging the corners, which is what you do in Photoshop. But you'll notice when I'm dragging it, it doesn't scale proportionally. Unless you have an extremely good eye that can tell when something is distorted, there's typically two recommended methods to scale proportionally. The first is to press the Shift key to scale proportionally. The second method is to come down to the transform section where you can drag it or just type in the number you want. These are the two recommended ways for scaling to make sure you don't distort anything, especially if you're working with images or logos. It's absolutely crucial that you don't squish or stretch or otherwise distort it in any way. The next mistake that may occur comes from animating position. This tends to happen more often when you paste keyframes. So in this example, even though with the pasted keyframes, the position doesn't change between the keyframes, you'll notice it bouncing back and forth between the two keyframes, starting and ending in the same position. There's a really simple fix for this. Just highlight the two keyframes, right-click, come over to Keyframe Interpolation and next to Spatial Interpolation, select Linear. So when we play it back, you'll notice how it stays still between 1 and 3 seconds. So that's two mistakes you'll likely run into when starting out in After Effects, and now you know the simple solutions for fixing them. Now that we're done creating the comps, we're ready to put everything together. There's two ways you can approach this. One is to create a new comp and use the comp and comp method to piece everything together. The second is to use Premiere Pro, where you can simply come over to Adobe Dynamic Link, import After Effects composition. So I'm going to select the After Effects tutorial file, where you can see all the compositions that we have. I've renamed them to 01, 02, and 03 in front, just so it's easy to find and know their order. Now I just need to select the compositions and click OK. I'm going to select the first one, right-click, and select New Sequence from Clip. What that does is create a new sequence while taking on the properties of the After Effects comp, or whatever footage you're using. To piece everything together, you just need to simply drag the other two compositions into the timeline. One thing to pay attention to is that playback in Premiere Pro tends to lag a bit for After Effects compositions. But this is what it looks like when we play through it. If you want, you can also go over to Effects, Video Transitions, and apply different transitions between the comps. For example, I'm going to apply the slide effect and drag it onto the clip. This is what it looks like with the slide transition. Now that we're done, we can export everything. So what I have here is different than what I showed you in Premiere Pro. This is the comp and comp method. As I've mentioned before, you want to make sure there are no gaps between the layers. Otherwise, there's going to be a flash of black. You can double check by zooming in, but right now, let's focus on exporting. So we'll go to File, Export, and you'll see that there's Add to Adobe Media Encoder and Add to Render Queue. Adding to render queue will typically give you a lossless MOV file. For our purposes, we don't need that, and it takes up a lot of memory. So instead, we're going to select Add to Adobe Media Encoder. Here, we can click on the file name where you choose where you want to save the file and what you want to name it. Let's call this Opening Sequence. You can also come over here where you have more options to work with. For example, you can work with different presets if you want a smaller file size or something with a lower resolution. You can also change the dimensions. Once everything is set up, just press play to start exporting. And with that, we're done. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial.